Hello everybody, I am Jared Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to My Racist White Jamaican Granny and My Ancestry DNA Results by Keenan Lambert. Now this is a channel I'm not familiar with at all. It's kind of on the medium small side of channels at 37,000 subscribers. But I checked out his channel. It seems to mainly be a travel vlog sort of channel, but also kind of like a underground culture nightlife sort of channel, largely based around traveling throughout the Caribbean. And I saw a lot of stuff about like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. So I get the feeling he has some sort of Caribbean ancestry, and depending on which island that may be coming from, that may adjust what we would expect. But typically with Caribbean ancestry, especially Afro-Caribbean, because that seems to be what his ancestry is, we're going to expect African, we're going to expect European, and then depending on what island his ancestry is coming from, that may adjust how much native ancestry you may expect. So if it's more of a Puerto Rican ancestry, I think it's a little bit more typical to find some of that Native American Taino ancestry in your results, as opposed to what I typically see with Jamaican results, which largely seem to be that European and African. But I'm really curious what this whole racist white Jamaican granny story may be about, hoping that, maybe it's genealogy he actually knows about his family.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is your brother, Keenan Lambert. And in this video, I'm going to discuss something a little bit more personal. Normally, you guys see me swinging from country to country, normally throughout Latin America. But in this video, I'm going to talk about my own family's history. So, my family's origin story, well, like most black people, like all black people, start in Africa. But let's move into more recent history. My family is directly coming out of different parts of Jamaica.
Okay.
With my mom being out of St. Elizabeth and Manchester, as well as my father growing up in St. Andrews, just beyond Kingston. Before we get into what the core of this video is about, let's talk about my DNA ancestor results. It's something that I did a few years ago, and some of the information has changed a little bit over time. However, the percentages have pretty much stayed the same in terms of what's coming out of which continent.
So I think it's really interesting he's starting with the DNA, and I'm guessing later he's going to go into the family history, whereas the way I prefer it's to go into the family history and then into the DNA, largely just because when you understand the family history and then you look at the DNA, then you can get a better idea of things. But based on the way he's talking about this, it sounds like he's kind of dove into his DNA results and may have done some extensive, research on his matches and other things, and understands it at a level that others don't. I don't know, we'll have to see. But it will be really interesting to see what his results are, because with Jamaican results, you can run the gamut of things. And, just the slogan of the country, or I guess is it the slogan or the motto, one people out of many? Or is it out of many, one people? Out of many, one people, yeah. So you can find all sorts of population groups throughout Jamaica, and in fact, I have a lot of family branches that were in Jamaica, more specifically Spanish Town, and I still have cousins that I'm in touch with who have Jamaican accents, and granted they're somewhat distant, but still it's one of those things that a lot of people are surprised about, like not just white Jamaicans, but then like white Sephardic Jewish Jamaicans.
In reading my report, we're going to go from the greatest amount to the lowest amount. So starting off first, we have Nigeria with 31%. Now, this is not a surprise. Ranging from the late 1600s to the 1800s, people were being dragged out of Africa and to the Caribbean islands. According to this, the majority of my family is coming out of Nigeria through this forced migration. Batting up second, we have Benin and Togo. Okay, Benin and Togo are just a little bit west of Nigeria.
And when you look at the maps, and you can see it here, while Benin and Togo are largely the darkest part of this blue over here to the right, the lighter parts you can see go much further, all the way up to, what is that, Senegal and the Gambia, and then all the way out east to Nigeria. So still kind of that same sort of area, and in all honesty, it makes sense with kind of what he was saying. It's really that Western Africa region where you're getting a lot of people that were enslaved and brought to the Americas. So whether you're coming from an African American ancestry largely within the United States, or an Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribbean, you're likely going to get a majority of that coming from West African, but possibly you could get some East African. It's definitely not uncommon.
It's part of a region that was once referred to as the Slave Coast, where people, again, were being dragged out of this region, forced out onto boats, and into the Caribbean, Latin America, etc. Up third, we have the Ivory Coast and Ghana at 8%. Now, this is very upsetting to my father because my father goes to Ghana all the time. And what he was particularly told is that his head shape indicates that the majority of his lineage is coming from a particular tribe in Ghana. You know, he's getting a lot of ancestry or DNA from other areas of Africa and not as much as he would hope from Ghana. So he was very upset about this part. Sorry, Dad. Batting up fourth, we have Yoruba land. Yoruba land is a little bit of a cheat code. As you can see that it stretches from Nigeria to Benin to Togo to a little bit of Ghana, the northern section of Ghana there, up into Burkina Faso. Batting up fifth at 6%, you have England and Northwestern Europe. Okay, the vast majority of people in Jamaica have a bit of this English ancestry for obvious reasons. Okay, over time being in Jamaica with a lot of Africans, as well as some privileged and in some cases not privileged English people, the mixing happened, which leads actually to my next ancestry point, which is coming out of Scotland at 4%. Again, this is a part of that ancestry that's coming out of the British Isles and coming into Jamaica and just remaining there.
And one thing I talk about all the time on this channel is that whole deal with the Northwestern European population groups, where if you're getting one of those, it's not uncommon to get other readings within Northwestern Europe, even if you don't necessarily have that ancestry. So even though we're getting both the Scottish reading as its own thing and the English reading as its own thing, in reality, it could be that if you looked at his perfect family history, you wouldn't find any Scottish ancestors until maybe thousands of years back or something. Or it could be the other way, where you'd only find Scottish and Irish and no English or something like that. And so it's hard to tell with the percentages itself. You can't really say for sure, oh yeah, I definitely have English and Scottish, or I definitely have English, but Scottish not so much, or the other way around. Basically it comes down to, okay, you have Northwestern European, and then you have to use other things, mostly the DNA matches and the more finite population groups they come up with. So some companies call it like ancestral journeys or genetic groups or things like that. And then along with Northwestern European, you get not just English and Scottish and Irish, obviously, but also France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, technically a little bit of Finland. And that's like, you see a lot of that kind of popping up because when you look at the population group flow of that, a lot of people will point to the Vikings, but it wasn't just Vikings. But you look at the population flows and you see throughout Northwestern Europe, a lot of people going back and forth from the Scandinavian countries to the British Isles to the northwestern side of continental Europe and, England and Netherlands and Belgium and France and Germany and all of that. So I'm not going to be surprised if he has in some of his smaller percentages some of that Swedish or Danish or Norse or whatever in there.
So batting up next at 3%, we have Central West African. Okay, pretty much anywhere in the former, what was referred to as the Slave Coast. Okay, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Burkina Faso.
Same areas we've been talking about already that we've seen a lot of percentages of.
Coming in at 3%, next up we have Western Bantu people. So anywhere within Central to almost South Africa, you have individuals that were coming out of that area, again, who were trafficked to the New World. Now, majority of this population went to nearby areas such as Brazil. I do have 3% of this ancestry mixing around, swirling around in my DNA. Okay, so let me just go right ahead and rattle off some of the lower percentages that are here. I'll actually whip out my phone for this one. So we have 3% Icelandic, okay. Then we have 3% Irish, coming out of Ireland, 2% Cameroonian, 1% Mali, 1% Nigerian woodlands, 1% Khoisan, Akka, and Mbuti peoples, 1% Ashkenazi Jewish.
Now that's an interesting one. We'll talk a bit more about that. I wonder if he'll mention anything, because if he knows anything about Jamaican history, there's a significant Jewish population, both Sephardi and Ashkenazi. And even though this says Ashkenazi specifically, doesn't mean that that's necessarily what his ancestry will be. But we'll talk about that more in a bit.
1% Sephardic Jewish, 1% Germanic Europe, and then 1% Portuguese. So that gives me a general split of about 80% African and then 20% European. Now, originally, when I had done this, it was 81% African and then 19% European, but it adjusted over time. Okay, and of course the regions switched around.
And this happens because they're constantly doing more studies, they're constantly analyzing the data, and they're trying to get a better idea of what's actually going on. And throughout the video, he was saying, you know, I have this much percentage in my ancestry and this much. And then the last one, he said something like 3% floating in my DNA, which is probably the closest way to say it to, or the closest way he said it so far to what it actually is. But what the best way to think of these tests is not like, you know, oh, he has 31% DNA that's Nigerian. It's more of 31% of the DNA that was tested, because remember, they're not testing all your DNA, but 31% of the DNA tested correlates to the population group that that company is defining as whatever. So that means that 31% of the DNA is correlating to what they're defining as Nigerian. And that 31% is figured out because they have a big group of people they've tested who have said, as far as they know, all of their ancestry is Nigerian. But one of the major issues with that is that a lot of times people don't know the extensive nuance of their family ancestry. So it'd be really hard for someone with African ancestry to really know, you know, back in the 1700s, where were all of their ancestors from? Were they all from Nigeria? Or was it much more of a mixture where really they might have a big part of their ancestry that they didn't realize was like a group of people that had migrated from Madagascar back over to the continent of Africa and then migrated up and made their way to Nigeria. And if you really looked at this person's DNA, 25+% of that is representative of this other migration that we don't really know that much about. And so then you're going to get a lot of stuff thrown off when you're reading these DNA tests. And so as they do more and more studies, they get a better idea of, okay, well, this DNA that we originally said was Nigerian, we're actually starting to see that it's really more common amongst these people that are much more in Madagascar or maybe even southeastern Africa, closer to Madagascar, and they can, you know, then maybe they figure that out. But largely when you see them change, just like he said, it's usually going to be pretty similar to what you saw, maybe a few minor changes. The times you'll see bigger changes is if they're really redefining the population groups, and especially like they take one larger group and then break it down into more subgroups. So for a long time, a lot of these DNA tests didn't have any sort of Dutch readings or Belgian readings or Denmark readings. It was more of like lumped into Scandinavia or France and Germany or other things. And now these tests are starting to have those readings much more specifically. So because of that, a lot of people that did have that in the readings before, well, if they have Dutch ancestry and then they go look at their DNA test, then it's probably going to be very different because a lot of whatever Dutch was being lumped into, well, now it's its own thing, and now they have to figure all the rest out in a different way. So sometimes it can be a lot more. But I think I'm rambling, so let's jump back into it.
At one point, I wasn't Irish at all, and then I became Irish to some degree. Okay, also, I wasn't at all Nigerian. Actually, I maybe had 1%, but now you can see that my DNA is, now a bulk of it is centered around that Nigerian area. Now, let's get into the story part.
Okay, well, before he gets into the story part, I want to jump into that Jewish reading, because he had both 1% Ashkenazi and 1% Sephardi. And with him having Jamaican ancestry, it is a high possibility that that is true Jewish ancestry. Could be Ashkenazi, could be Sephardi, could actually be a mixture of both, because there were Ashkenazi and Sephardi marriages in Jamaica, not always common around the world. But if this is true, and assuming that all of this Jewish ancestry is coming from the same ancestor, it's not like he has a Jewish ancestor on his mom's side and a Jewish ancestor on his dad's side. It's just one recent ancestor that 2% Jewish DNA, 1% Ashkenazi, 1% Sephardi is coming from. And for anyone going, well, it says Ashkenazi and says Sephardi, so how can you say that you're not sure? Well, it goes back to what I've been saying, where they can only get a general idea based on people that say, well, as far as I know, I have mostly Ashkenazi, or as far as I know, I have mostly Sephardi. But for Jewish readings, it's even harder because for a lot of Jewish populations, it's really difficult to decipher between them. There's a lot of shared DNA. So it's been very difficult for any of the companies for years to be able to strongly decipher Ashkenazi and Sephardi, and the Ancestry only recently started to do that. For a long time, they only had European Jewish. And there's a few other sites, I think 23andMe still doesn't have a Sephardi reading. I could be wrong on that. They might have rolled one out because they have been doing a lot of update stuff too. But with Jamaican records, they're actually pretty decent. And if he worked on his family tree, which he may have done that, and maybe when he talks about the story, he'll talk about known Jewish ancestry. But basically, through genealogy, he could possibly figure out that Jewish ancestor if they are there. The other question with that too is that Jewish ancestry coming through some of the same lines where some of this other European ancestry is coming from, and as well some of the Jews that were in Jamaica did enslave people, and so there is that possibility of that typical history of people who were enslaved then having the children of their masters. That's something that could be a possibility in his ancestry as well, which is very possible of where he's getting that European ancestry, but it's not always the only way that that ancestry may be coming through, because that could be coming through a much more recent ancestry, so maybe within the past, 150 years, 200 years, and that's actually coming from consensual relationships. So it can be both. For anyone that has ancestors who were enslaved in the Americas, it's kind of just a common story throughout. I mean, it varies by different countries because the different countries emancipated people at different times and did it in different ways. And so the story of how everybody mixed together will change by those countries. But from what I've seen within Jamaica, I find that a lot of the DNA results I've seen, which includes a lot of my cousins who are both largely Jewish or cousins who are actually largely African, and you see that big mixture in both of them, but then you'll see that, for my cousins that are largely Jewish, they have a lot more of the Jewish ancestry, but they have more European readings than my other cousins. They have more African readings. Like, it's very common. I think all the ones I've seen from my cousins from Jamaican ancestry, they all have at least a couple of percentages of African, but then you see some of the cousins that I've connected with who have actually largely African ancestry, and they'll have like 6% Sephardic and 6% Ashkenazi and things like that. Granted, they know of much more recent, like a great-grandparent who is fully Jewish sort of thing. But having had the experience of being able to see both those sides from cousins of mine, it's very cool to see how both of them have that massive mosaic of all sorts of readings, both in Europe, both in Africa, and then with that mixture of the Jewish.
The African side of my family, the African sides, are coming from my father as well as my mother. My father is heavily African with barely any European ancestry. It might be maybe 2 or 3%, something small like that.
I wonder if his parents have done a DNA test, because if they did, it'd be really cool to be able to see their results. Obviously, knowing that if they have the DNA that he's inheriting, then all of the DNA that they have that he didn't inherit, well, that's going to tell them more about their side of things. So, he only got 50% from mom, he only got 50% from dad, but mom and dad have a whole 50% of their DNA that he didn't get. That's going to correlate to some population group. So with that Jewish DNA result we're talking about, maybe you look at his parents' test and you see, mom has 0% Jewish, but then you look at dad and he has 4% Ashkenazi, 3% Sephardi. And then it's like, oh, wow, okay, so it definitely has to be through dad's side. And then you also have a better idea of, well, how far back it is, because the closer you get, the more in line it gets to the expected amount of recombination. So what I mean by that is that you inherit 50% of your DNA from your mom and your dad, But then you get 25% of your DNA from your grandparents and 12.5% from your great-grandparents and so on and so forth. But it's not actually perfect like that. So with your grandparents, you might not get 25%. You're going to get maybe about 24, 23, 22, 21, or maybe more. And then same thing with your great-grandparents. Instead of getting just 12.5%, you might get 8%, you might get 15%. It could vary. But as you get further out in that distance, the variation could change a lot. So hopefully that all makes sense. I feel like I'm rambling again, but basically, if his parents have done a DNA test, having their test as part of the video would be a great way to get a much better idea of what's going on.
Much of the European DNA is actually coming from my mom's side. She's from a very, very rural part of Jamaica, a place that was originally farmland. Now it's urbanized and they have some industries, okay, maybe over the last 70 years, okay, but initially this was farm country. And there were individuals of European descent who settled there, stayed there, and ended up blending into the population. If you go ahead and look up German Jamaicans, okay, there are a bunch of YouTube videos on German Jamaicans. They're coming out of that similar area where German families moved to Jamaica. They had it really, really rough and sort of developed a community there in that side of Jamaica.
And with German ancestry, it's possible to have ancestors who came from Germany. But if you look at what their ancestry really is, it's leaning much more towards the Northwestern European ancestry. And so some of these readings that he's getting that are that Northwestern European sort of stuff, that could actually be some German. So especially that, I think it's England and Northwestern European is actually what it's called, I think. Unless they changed it, they might have. But either way, that could be part of that German ancestry. But it just happens to be read as England and Northwestern European instead of German. So that's a big difficulty with these percentages. You never know truly where it's actually coming from. You just kind of have a general idea, a blurry image of what it could be.
Okay, but however, maybe in the last 50, 60 years, they've blended into the population, so they're making mixed brown children. Okay, now, the area that my mom is from, maybe about 60, 70 years ago, a lot of brown mixed people. So my mom's great-grandmother was actually a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman. And from what I know about her story is actually pretty interesting. So I don't know how or why she moved to Portland, Maine, of all places, but she moved to Portland, Maine. And in Portland, Maine, she met a black man who was also from Jamaica, Easton Powell. Okay, so Louise Brooks and Easton Powell met in all places, Portland, Maine, and then they made a child together. So on his birth certificate, it actually stated the profession of my great-great-grandfather. He was a firefighter, apparently, in Portland, Maine, and she was a homemaker. And they had this child together, and they stayed in Maine for about 4 or 5 years, from what I understand. They found the culture, the environment to not be very accepting of a mixed family. And also, I am pretty sure that those cold winters probably got to them. Okay, so as opposed to being in Jamaica, 90 degrees Fahrenheit majority of the time, and going up to Portland, Maine, where regularly temperatures are below freezing, I'm sure it got to them over
it's
time.
A huge
so they
difference.
moved back to Jamaica and then had the rest of their children in Jamaica.
Huge difference.
Just to be specific, this is happening in the early 1910s time, if you will. Now, Louise Brooks was affectionately known as Marlou. That was her nickname. In Jamaica, everybody has a nickname. You're not actually referred to by your actual name. Everyone has a nickname. And so let me tell you an interesting story that I've been told from that time. Now, getting towards the end of her life, she was sort of, as they would say in Jamaica, losing her reason. Okay, right? So maybe there might have been some dementia that was creeping in towards the end of her life. And interesting enough, Marlou, Louise Brooks, became or was exhibiting racist behavior. So my mom's first cousin, who I referred to as Auntie, so we'll just say Auntie, was 6 or 7 at the time. Now, she was just milling about the house as the other children were at the same time. And Marlou, Louise Brooks, spotted her and said to my great-grandmother, Mavis, and she said this in Patois, but we'll just translate it to English, Mavis, whose black child is this in my house? And then kicked the child, my aunt, down the stairs. Now, she was a little bit different from the other children. She was a lot more chocolate, if you will. And Marlu, in her mindset at the time, I guess, colorism was there at that point, even though she married a black man. And she then proceeded to kick this child down the stairs. Now, saying this on camera, it feels tragic, but within my family, it's been something that, we've over time laughed about. Now, this story is particularly wild because Marlo Louise Brooks married a black man and had, for the time, what was referred to as black children. So then how is it that as she got older in her, her questionable mind space at the time, how is it that she would have the capacity to become racist? Was it always in there? Was it something that she suppressed? I don't know. Thank you so much for watching this video. It's been an experience telling you guys a bit of my story.
Okay, that was a pretty good video. Always would be much more amazing if showed some DNA matches, but totally understand the focus is more on kind of the story, and the DNA results just add a little bit to that. Very, very interesting family history, obviously. And I am curious if he's ever done actual genealogy research. It sounds like he's done some. It sounds like he's done hobbyist genealogy research where it's every once in a while kind of goes into the databases, plays around with it a bit, adds stuff here and there, but not kind of a, every day or every other day or once a week sort of thing. But I could be wrong. Would definitely be interested to see what the parents' DNA results are, especially seeing which side might have that Jewish ancestry. And especially with the thought in mind of, well, if he has Jewish ancestry in Jamaica, there is a small possibility that he and I could be distant cousins. So if you see the Nunes Vaz name or a Vaz name in your family tree, that could be a connection between us. Other than that, pretty typical, I think, of what I usually see with Jamaican results. Kind of like I said in the beginning, not that common that I feel like I see a lot of Native American results for people from Jamaica. And I don't think he had any Native American. It was all African and European with that little bit of Jewish, which sometimes gets lumped into European, sometimes it gets lumped into Middle Eastern, sometimes it just gets lumped into its own thing. But if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see other reactions just like it, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.